Every student of a difficult text hears the same advice. Bring nothing to it. Empty your head of what you already think. Let the words speak for themselves. Bernard Lonergan says that produces worse readers, not better ones. That is the argument of Chapter 7 of Method in Theology. Lonergan calls the whole business interpretation. Episode 6 left the data gathered, cataloged, edited, sitting in front of you. And it closed on a question. What exactly did the person who wrote it mean? That question has a name, and that name is interpretation. Now, not every text needs one. Euclid wrote a geometry that had stood for, 23 centuries? People still study it. Nobody interprets it. A systematic text has one correct reading, and a wrong reading can simply be shown wrong. Compare that to the Gospels. Short, plain, almost childlike. And yet they have generated more commentary than almost anything ever written. Why the difference? Well, because common sense meaning only works inside a community that shares it. Send an obvious sentence across centuries and cultures, and it starts to wobble. Horizons differ. Values differ. Interests differ. 4 factors, though, make it worse today. World and historical consciousness, aware of cultures and centuries we will never see. The human sciences, where meaning itself is the basic subject matter. Confusion in cognitional theory, bleeding straight into confusion about interpreting. And modernity, busy rereading the whole past, stripping the classics of their Christian setting, resetting scripture inside the history of religions instead of doctrine. So the difficulty is real, but Lonergan draws a line most discussions never draw. Deeper questions get dressed up as hermeneutical questions when they are not. Not every disagreement about a text belongs to interpretation. Some belong to history, dialectic, foundations, doctrines, systematics, and communications. Interpretation, he insists, has its own proper end, a telos. Lonergan fixes 2 words first. First, hermeneutics. Second, exegesis. Hermeneutics, he says, means the principles of interpretation. Exegesis means those principles applied to one task, one text. Hermeneutics is the theory. Exegesis is the theory at work on one letter, one psalm, not throat clearing. Because everything in this chapter is hermeneutics, general enough for any exegetical task you will ever face. Then the chapter's whole map. 3 basic exegetical operations. Understand the text, judge how correct that understanding is, state what you judge to be correct, and understanding itself breaks into 4 aspects. Understanding the object, understanding the word, understanding the author, and when the text demands it, understanding yourself. Reach through a process of learning, and at times as a result of conversion. 4 aspects, 1 single act of coming to understand. But we must begin where Lonergan begins, understanding the object. A student reads a text to learn about something he does not know. An exegete is different, though. He may already know everything about the subject, and his task still remains undone. His job was never to know about the object, only to know what the author had in mind. And the more the exegete already knows, the better. He can't start without knowing the language. And knowing it means already knowing what the words point to. When the meaning is not obvious, that knowledge lets him weigh every possible reading and rank its likelihood. Now return to the advice from the opening. Bring nothing. Empty your head. Lonergan gives that a term, a name. The principle of the empty head, he states its case exactly here. So in brief, the less one knows, the better an exegete one will be. That principle worries about a real evil, interpreters who put opinions into an author's mouth he never held. And the complaint is right, but the cure is not right. It assumes an interpreter simply looks at a text and sees what is there. There is just a series of signs. Anything over and above a reissue of the same sign in the same order will be mediated by the experience, intelligence, and judgment of the interpreter, not a smaller mind reading more purely, not a blanker mind reading more objectively, a better formed mind reading more accurately. That is the correction. The remedy for reading yourself into a text is not less of a self. It is a self trained enough to get out of the way. So understanding the object gives you the plain meaning. Obvious because the author and the reader already agree. Agreement is not guaranteed. Sometimes the author is speaking of one thing, call it P, and you are thinking of another, call it Q. Not everything true of P is true of Q, so the text starts to sound false. Two different readers appear here. The controversialist assumes the author is wrong and sets out to prove it. The interpreter assumes he himself is at fault and rereads. Not a technique. What we have is an ethic. Rudolf Bultmann made a similar point, that no interpreter can silence himself, and Lonergan agrees as far as it goes. But he pushes further. Understanding a text, formulating that understanding, and judging whether it is true are three different acts, not one blurred act. Confuse them, and understanding gets mistaken for judgment. You only ever read a whole text one part at a time. So how do you understand the whole before you have read every part? You don't, not fully, not at first at least, right? Lonergan names the puzzle the hermeneutic circle. Logically, he says, it is a circle, but coming to understand is not a logical deduction. It is a self-correcting process of learning that spirals into the meaning of the whole. Not a trap, not a stalemate, a spiral. Each new part correcting what the earlier part had only half revealed. Nobody breaks the circle by logic. People break it by rereading, letting each new page correct the last. So rules of exegesis are useful, but Lonergan reverses the order in his standard style. You do not understand a text because you followed the rules. You follow the rules to arrive at an understanding. For their own sake, rules produce only pedantry. And sometimes rereading is not even enough. A first reading yields a little understanding and a great many puzzles. A second yields barely more understanding and even more puzzles. Then the problem is no longer the object or even the words. The problem is the author himself, his nation, his language, his culture, his whole cast of mind. That same self-correcting process that builds your own common sense also builds an understanding of somebody else's. You can tell when a remark is just like a friend because you have absorbed how that friend thinks. Push that process further, across centuries instead of a dinner table, and you reach an understanding of another place's common sense. That, Lonergan says, is the enormous labor of becoming a scholar. But be careful. Be careful what that phrase means. It's it's not learning to speak and act like a 5th century Athenian or 1st century Christian. Nobody's asking you to go native. Understanding another's common sense means knowing what he would say and do in situations that commonly arose in his own time, not becoming him, knowing him well enough to predict him. Then the turn that gives the chapter its center of gravity, understanding oneself. The great classics in religion, letters, philosophy, theology are beyond the reader's starting horizon. Lonergan says something more demanding than that. Horizon, conversion. They may demand an intellectual, moral, religious conversion of the interpreter over and above any broadening of his horizon. Broadening a horizon is what ordinary scholarship already does. A new language, a new period, and the horizon gets wider. Conversion is not wider. Conversion is a different center. Not every text does this. Euclid never does. Only the classics may. And Lonergan is actually quite careful with that word. May, not must. This is the existential dimension of interpretation. And it sits, he says, at the root of humanity's oldest divisions over reality, morality, and religion. Because working out everything from a deeper viewpoint is itself endless labor. Friedrich Schlegel gave the classic its sharpest definition, and Lonergan quotes him directly. A classic is a writing that is never fully understood, but those that are educated and educate themselves must always want to learn more from it. And the classics also ground a tradition, producing in every reader a cast of mind before he ever opens the book. Lonergan actually gives it a German term, which is translated to pre-understanding. Now, that tradition can go two ways. Authentic, a long accumulation of insight that repeats the original message afresh for every age. Read that way, a reader's heart burns within him, the way the disciples' hearts burned on the road to Emmaus. Or unauthentic, a watering down that recasts the message to fit whatever its heirs believe, heirs who dodged conversion themselves. Read inside that tradition, a genuine interpretation sounds like nonsense, the way Paul sounded to a crowd in Rome that could hear him and still not understand the word. At this point, interpretation cannot stay interpretation. To know not only what an author meant, but what is actually so, the interpreter must become critical of more than his author, critical of the tradition that shaped his own mind. His phrase for what happens next is actually quite exact. With that step, he is propelled beyond writing history to making history. That's the first operation. Now the second operation, judging the correctness of your interpretation. The criterion is the one you already use for any common sense judgment. Are there further relevant questions left? Questions that could still complicate, correct, or overturn what you understand. If none remain, the insight is invulnerable. If some remain, well, you are not finished yet. But which questions count as relevant? Not the ones you started with. You begin with your own Fraglingstung, your own prior interests and concerns. The study itself slowly displaces them. The longer you read, the more you discover the questions that concern the author. Your questions get set aside. His questions become your own. That raises a word Lonergan spends real effort defining: context. It has two meanings, and confusing them, well, causes the trouble. Heuristically, context tells you where to keep looking. word to sentence, sentence to paragraph, paragraph to chapter, chapter to book, book to the author's whole life, and times. Context as a map, pointing further outward without end. Actually, context means something narrower. Context, he says, is a nest of interlocked or interwoven questions and answers, not the map. The limited set of questions bearing on one single topic. Because that set is limited, it eventually runs dry. That is the moment judgment becomes possible. An unlimited context would leave every interpretation permanently unfinished. A limited one lets you finally stop and say something. It is so. Insights multiply fast, then slower, until one can say just what was going forward and back it up with the convergence of multitudinous evidence, not a guess, the arrival of an overall view. And Lonergan quotes something Collingwood once praised, words from Lord Acton. Study problems, not periods, not eras, not centuries, not decades. Follow one question wherever it leads, across as much time as it takes. Once the question on a topic runs dry, the exegete speaks with calibrated confidence. Probable, highly probable, in some respects, certain. A few pages later, Lonergan corrects two famous claims. Collingwood said history is the historian reenacting the past inside his own thought. Schleiermacher said the interpreter understands a text better than its own author did. Something right in both, something misleading in both. And he proves it from his own scholarly life. Thomas Aquinas developed his theology of grace slowly, across more than a dozen years of writing, conscious each time of what he was doing. But he never once surveyed the whole development, watching his own thought move from where it started to where it ended. The interpreter does exactly that, building the overall view Aquinas himself never built. So Schleiermacher's partly right. An interpreter can understand fully and precisely something the author himself only sensed vaguely. That does not mean he understands the text better than the author did. He rarely has access to the sources behind its smaller details. And Collingwood is partly right too. The interpreter really does reconstruct. It is not true that in thought he reproduces the past. Aquinas was developing a doctrine. The interpreter is building the evidence for one chapter in that history. They are different tasks, not the same task twice. One distinction saves this from collapsing. Every author is conscious of what he is doing. Very few know what they are doing in the sense of having examined it. Consciousness and self-knowledge are not the same thing, and turning one into the other takes real work. That is why true development happens slowly. His phrase is memorable. The insight that provokes the cry, Eureka, is just the last insight in a long series of slowly accumulating insights, not a lightning strike, the final step in a staircase nobody saw built. Now the third operation, stating what you have judged. Here Lonergan draws a line he cares about intensely. The exegete qua exegete is not trying to speak to the present. He is trying to listen to the past. Every one of the 8 specialties understands text, but each for a different end. Research settles what actually is written. Interpretation settles what was meant. History settles what was going forward in a whole community. Dialectic uses understood texts to stage an encounter between rival positions. Foundations uses them to objectify a conversion. Doctrines, systematics, and communications each use them again, but differently. 8 sets of operations, 8 distinct ends. Whole concern that Lonergan has for Methodists to stop what he calls the blind imperialism that selects some of the ends, insists on their importance, and neglects the rest. Exactly what happens when a preacher borrows a theologian's vocabulary or an exegete tries to do a historian's job. And here is his sharpest line of all. Theology is not a religion. Theology reflects on the religion. It promotes the religion, but it does not constitute religious events. Conversion happens in becoming religious, not in doing theology. An exegete's need to understand himself may be the condition of understanding his author, but it is not part of his job description. It is an event of a higher order in his own personal life. So how does the exegete actually speak once his work is done? Differently, depending on who he is listening. The colleagues, maybe, technically in notes and monographs that use every tool research provides. To pupils, through a seminar, retracting the trail their teacher followed. And to the wider theological community, patiently respecting each biblical author's voice rather than flattening them into one system, giving readers a feel for what is foreign and strange and archaic. That patient method needs one more piece. Not portraits of the Hebrew mind or Hellenism or the spirit of the age. Those portraits generate what Lonergan calls occult entities, explanations that explain nothing. And his words are blunt here. They are. What is needed is not mere description, but explanation. Show people how elements in their own experience were assembled into an ancient mode of meaning, and why real explanation is not a costume. So let me bring the chapter together. Interpretation understands the object, the words, the author, and when a text demands it, the interpreter himself. It judges that understanding until no further relevant question survives. It states what it has judged, differently for colleagues, differently for pupils, differently for everyone else waiting to hear it in a language they can use. Do all of that honestly, and you are pushed past interpretation itself. You become critical not only of your author, but of the tradition that forms your own mind. In the next episode, we move to history because interpretation can only ever tell you what one author meant. No single author saw the whole of what was actually happening around him. So once you know what he meant, the next question can no longer wait. What then was going forward? Not in one writer's mind, but in the whole community he belonged to.